I thought the creaking floorboards and cold drafts were just the quirks of an old house, until I found the hidden door. It wasn't just sealed away, it was locked for a reason, what I unleashed. When I opened it, will haunt me forever. When I first bought the house, it felt like stepping into a dream. It was a charming Victorian era home perched on the outskirts of a quiet, picturesque town, the kind of place you see on postcards, white picket fences, sprawling oak trees, and a wraparound porch that begged for quiet mornings with a cup of coffee. For someone like me who had endured a whirlwind of personal upheaval over the past year, this house represented more than just shelter. It was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild my life far away from the noise and chaos I was leaving behind. The house had undeniable character. The original wooden floors carried the weight of history, creaking softly with every step like a distant echo of the lives that came before me. Intricate molding traced the ceilings, hinting at the craftsmanship of a bygone era. The windows, framed by heavy drapes, filtered the light in a way that bathed each room in a warm golden hue. It wasn't just a house, it was a home, my home. Still, it wasn't without its quirks. The floors groaned louder than they should have for a structure that appeared so sturdy, as if the house were alive and restless beneath my feet. A persistent chill lingered in certain corners, defying the central heating system and making me wonder if drafts had somehow found their way in through unseen cracks. And then there were the whispers. At first I told myself it was the wind. The house sat on a slight hill with trees that swayed in the breeze, their branches brushing against the siding. Late at night, when everything else was silent, I'd hear faint murmurs drifting through the halls. Sometimes they seemed like distant conversations just out of earshot, other times a low, almost imperceptible hum. I convinced myself it was nothing more than my imagination, amplified by the isolation and stillness of my new surroundings. Neighbors occasionally commented on the house with polite curiosity. One elderly woman smiled wistfully when I mentioned where I'd moved. "That old place," she said, her tone light but her expression guarded.
"It has quite the history, Never seems to keep anyone for
long. When I pressed her for details, she waved it off, attributing it to the usual struggles of owning an old home, maintenance, creaks, and the occasional oddity. I chalked it up to that as well. Old homes have their secrets, don't they? Stories buried in their walls, memories etched into their foundations. I didn't mind the quirks. If anything, they added to the charm. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the discovery that would unravel everything. What I uncovered in that house would turn my dream into a waking nightmare, haunting me long after I left its doors behind. It started as an ordinary Saturday project. The study had been one of the most neglected rooms in the house, with peeling wallpaper, faded curtains, and a musty smell that hinted at years of disuse. I'd decided to spruce it up, figuring a fresh coat of paint and some new furniture would transform the space. Removing the wallpaper was tedious but manageable, at least at first. Armed with a spray bottle and scraper, I slowly peeled back the layers, revealing the pale plaster underneath. Then I hit a snag. In one corner of the room, no amount of scraping or spraying seemed to loosen the wallpaper. It clung stubbornly, as if something beneath it didn't want to be revealed. Frustration turned to determination. I grabbed a utility knife and carefully cut along the edge, peeling away a larger section. What I uncovered made me freeze. There, beneath the paper, was a faint outline of a door. It was small, about 4 feet high, with thick coats of paint sealing it shut. Across the door were several rusted metal strips, nailed in place with what looked like hand-forged iron nails. Whoever had sealed this door hadn't just done so to hide it. They'd gone to great lengths to ensure it couldn't be opened. I stood there, staring at it. My initial excitement at uncovering something hidden was quickly replaced by a creeping unease. The door felt wrong somehow, out of place. I couldn't shake the sensation that it was watching me, even though I knew that was impossible. My thoughts raced. Why would someone go to such lengths to seal a door? Was it hiding something valuable or something dangerous? And why hadn't the realtor mentioned anything about it during the sale? I ran my fingers along the edges of the door, feeling the cool, smooth surface of the paint. The metal strips were corroded, their edges sharp to touch. It didn't seem like anyone had disturbed the door in decades, maybe even a century. My mind wandered to all the possibilities: a forgotten wine cellar, a hidden storage room, or maybe a relic of the house's history. But the more I stared, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing at the edge of something I wasn't meant to uncover. I backed away slowly, the unease settling like a weight in my chest. The room felt colder now, as if the door's presence had drawn all the warmth from them. Air. I spent the rest of the day avoiding the study, pretending that what I'd found wasn't gnawing at my curiosity. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I could swear I heard faint knocking, soft and rhythmic, coming from the wall where the door was hidden. Probably just the house settling, I told myself. Old homes make noise after all, but deep down I wasn't so sure. The knocking haunted me all night, each sound pulling me further into wakefulness. By morning, I was convinced it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. That's what I told myself as I sipped my coffee, staring out the kitchen window and trying to shake the sense of unease that had settled into my chest. Yet, no matter how much I tried to distract myself, my mind kept returning to that door.
What was behind it, and why did it feel so wrong?
By evening, my curiosity had reached a breaking point. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to leave it alone, to seal the wallpaper back over the door and forget it existed. But something deeper, something primal and stubborn, demanded I investigate. I couldn't let it go. Grabbing a crowbar, a flashlight, and a hammer, I headed back to the study. As I stood in front of the door, the unease from the day before came rushing back, stronger than ever. My hands trembled as I wedged the crowbar under the first rusted strip of metal. With a loud screech, the strip popped free and a sharp, metallic smell filled the room. The air seemed to grow colder with every strip I removed. By the time I pried the last one loose, I was shivering. My breath puffed in the air like it was the middle of winter. I hesitated before gripping the edge of the door and pulling it open. The hinges groaned in protest, sound echoing through the room. Behind the door was a narrow staircase, descending into pitch-black darkness. Immediately, damp earth, rot, and something metallic, like rusted iron. It was overwhelming, making my stomach churn. I shone my flashlight down the stairs, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. The walls were rough stone, carved unevenly as if someone had hacked them out by hand. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to close the door and walk away, but curiosity and a strange, almost magnetic pull drove me forward. My footsteps echoed as I descended, each step taking me deeper into the cold, stale air. At the bottom of the stairs, the light from my flashlight revealed a small, low-ceilinged room. The floor was dirt, packed hard over the years. The walls were covered in strange, unfamiliar markings, etched deeply into the stone. At the center of the room was a crude altar, its surface littered with decayed objects, a cracked mirror, a locked leather-bound journal, and a box wrapped in chains. Candles, long melted in misshapen blobs, surrounded the altar in a circle. I stood there, frozen, every nerve in my body screaming to leave. The air felt alive, heavy with something I couldn't name. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement in the shadows. Without thinking, I snatched the journal from the altar and bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. The basement felt like stepping into another world, one I wasn't meant to enter. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air shifted, heavier, colder, as though it was pressing down on me. My flashlight's beam danced across the rough stone walls, illuminating strange, jagged symbols carved deep into the surface. They weren't just random scratches. They were deliberate, intricate, and somehow threatening. Each mark seemed to pulse in the dim light, as if the very walls were alive and breathing. At the center of the room stood a crude altar, crafted from rough, dark stone. It was smeared with a dried, rust-colored residue that made my stomach turn. Surrounding it was a chaotic collection of decayed objects. The first thing my flashlight caught was a cracked mirror, its jagged surface reflecting distorted fragments of my face. Next to it was a locked, leather-bound journal, its cover warped and stained with age, but it was the box that held my attention. The box was unlike anything I'd ever seen, small but menacing, wrapped tightly in heavy iron chains. The links were thick and rusted, as though they'd been there for centuries. Symbols, similar to those on the walls, were etched into the chains and the box itself. It radiated a strange energy that made my skin crawl. The remnants of long-melted candles surrounded the altar, their wax pooling into grotesque, uneven shapes. The faint smell of burnt tallow lingered in the air, mixing with the earthy stench of damp soil and rot. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering like a dying heartbeat. For a moment, the shadows at the edge of the room seemed to shift and twist, as if they were alive. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. The oppressive silence of the room was broken by the faintest of sounds. Whispers. They were faint at first, almost inaudible, but they grew louder, overlapping and swirling around me. The voices were fragmented, speaking in a language I couldn't understand, their tones fluctuating between pleading and angry. Summoning every ounce of courage, I stepped closer to the altar. The journal seemed like the only thing that might provide answers. My hand trembled as I reached for it, the leather feeling cold and damp against my fingertips. The moment I picked it up, the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The stillness was almost worse than the sound. Without looking back, I bolted up the stairs, my flashlight bouncing erratically in my hand. My breath came in ragged gasps as I slammed the hidden door shut, pressing my weight against it. As if something might try to follow me, I stood there, trembling, clutching the journal to my chest. The house was silent now, but the weight of what I'd seen below stayed with me, its presence as heavy as the door I had just sealed. Once I was back upstairs, I locked the door to the study, as if that would somehow keep the darkness at bay. I placed the journal on the dining table, its leather cover cracked and discolored with age. My hands shook as I opened it, the musty smell of its pages wafting up to greet me. The handwriting inside was spidery and uneven, as though written in haste. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. The first page was dated 1892 and bore the name Edward Hastings. He had apparently lived in the house over a century ago. His initial entries were mundane, details of renovations he'd undertaken, complaints about the dampness of the basement, and musings about the solitude of the countryside. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone changed. Edward began describing strange occurrences in the house. At first, it was little things, objects, moving from where he'd left them, faint noises at night that he attributed to the house settling. But soon, the disturbances grew more sinister. He wrote of hearing whispers, soft and distant at first, but growing louder with each passing night. Shadows moved in his periphery, darting just out of sight. Doors slammed shut without cause, and cold spots appeared in rooms where no drafts should have been. As the entries progressed, Edward's handwriting grew more erratic, his words frantic. He wrote of being awakened in the middle of the night by voices calling his name, their tones mocking and malevolent. He described nightmares of being trapped in a dark room, surrounded by figures with hollow eyes and twisted faces. It became clear that Edward had discovered the hidden basement as well. He wrote of the altar, the symbols in the box wrapped in chains. According to him, the box contained something powerful and malevolent, something that demanded to be kept locked away, he recounted. Rituals he had performed, offerings of blood, fire, and incantations to appease whatever entity resided below. The final entry was barely legible, the ink smeared and the words scrawled hastily. It read, "The door must never be opened. To disturb it is to invite ruin. The voices grow louder. They want me to open the box, but I will not. God help whoever finds this. I slam the journal shut, my breath shallow and rapid. Edward's warnings echoed in my mind. I had already opened the door. I had disturbed it. And now whatever Edward had feared was awake. For the next few days, I tried to convince myself that everything I'd experienced was a mix of exhaustion and an overactive imagination, but the house had other plans. It started subtly. I would leave a chair by the dining table, only to return and find it facing them. Opposite direction. The doors that I swore I'd closed would be slightly ajar when I passed. Then again, at first I blamed my forgetfulness, brushing it off as nothing more than a coincidence. But the occurrences grew bolder. Shadows began to move in the corners of rooms where there was no light source. I would catch them out of the corner of my eye, fleeting, darting figures. That vanished the moment I turned to look. At night, the footsteps started, slow, deliberate, and heavy. They echoed in the upstairs hallway. Each time I would rush to investigate, only to find the hallway empty. The whispers were the worst. At first, they were faint, barely audible, like a breeze passing through the walls. But each night, they grew louder. Sometimes, they sounded like my name, hissed from the shadows with a mocking tone. Other times, they were guttural and angry words I couldn't understand, but that filled me with dread all the same. One night, I woke to find something new. On the bathroom mirror were handprints, large, smudged prints that didn't match mine. They trailed down the glass as if something, had pressed their palms against it and dragged them downward. My blood ran cold. I hadn't heard anyone enter. By the time I realized the house wasn't just haunted but angry, it was too late to turn back. I had reached my breaking point. The whispers, the shadows, the cold that seeped into my bones. It was all too much. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The house felt more alive and hostile. With each passing day, something had to give, and I knew what it was. I needed to go back to the basement to face whatever nightmare I had awakened. I spent hours working up the courage. It wasn't easy to steel myself for what lay below, armed. With a flashlight and a hammer, I descended into the basement once more. The air grew colder. With every step, my breath forming clouds in the dim light. My flashlight trembled in my grip as I reached the bottom of the stairs. The chain box sat on the altar, just as I had left it. It seemed to radiate malice, as though it knew I had come to disturb its rest. I hesitated, standing motionless in the oppressive silence of the room. The strange symbols on the walls seemed to ripple under the light, their meaning lost to me, but their intent unmistakably dark. I stepped closer to the altar, each footfall feeling heavier than the last. The box loomed before me, its chains rusted and thick, as if they had been placed there to ensure whatever it held stayed locked away forever. My hammer felt like dead weight in my hand, but something deep inside me, a mix of defiance and desperation, urged me forward. The first strike against the chains echoed through the room, unnaturally loud like a gunshot in a tomb. I winced, half expecting the walls to collapse or the floor to open beneath me. The second strike sent a shiver up my spine as the chains gave way. With a final swing, the last link snapped, and the chains fell to the dirt floor with a heavy clang. I hesitated before opening the box, my hands trembling as I pried the lid free. Unlike anything I'd ever seen, it was grotesque, a twisted amalgamation of humanoid features, and something distinctly inhuman. Its surface was smooth, yet somehow jagged, made of a material I couldn't identify. It felt wrong just to look at it, as though its very existence defied nature. The moment I touched the idol, the world around me dissolved. My vision blurred, and I was pulled into a horrifying cascade of images. I saw people gathered in the basement, chanting in an ancient guttural language. Their faces were obscured by shadows, but their voices were unmistakably desperate and fanatical. I saw blood spilling onto the altar, soaking into the dirt floor. I saw the spirits of those who'd been sacrificed, their faces contorted in eternal agony, their hollow eyes staring back at me as though they could see into my soul. I snapped back to reality, gasping for air, the idol still clutched in my hands. I staggered back, my legs barely able to support me. Whatever this object was, it wasn't just cursed, it was alive. Terrified and unsure of what to do, I knew I couldn't handle this alone. I had to find someone. Who could help? My first thought was to visit the local library, hoping to dig up any information about the house or its history. There, I stumbled on a mention of a man named Robert, the town's unofficial historian. When I arrived at Robert's home, he greeted me with a mix of curiosity and wariness. I told him everything: the hidden basement, the strange altar, the idol, and the escalating disturbances. As I spoke, his expression darkened, and he nodded grimly. "This town has a history," he began, leaning back in his chair. "Your house in particular. It belonged to a group of people who called themselves the Watchers. They were a cult, though. They preferred the term keepers. They believed they were guarding something ancient and dangerous. A spirit, a demon, I don't know for sure. They performed rituals to bind it, using that idol as a kind of anchor." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Anchor?" I asked. He nodded. "The idol binds the entity to the house, keeps it tethered to this world, but it also feeds it, keeps it alive. That's why the disturbances are getting worse. The moment you opened that door, you disrupted the balance." Panic bubbled in my chest. How do I stop it? Robert hesitated, clearly reluctant to answer. Destroying the idol might break the curse. But it won't be easy. The spirit is tied to it. It won't let you destroy it without a fight. Despite the warning, I knew I had no other choice. The house had become unbearable, a prison of terror and unease. I thanked Robert and left, determined to end this once and for all. That night, I prepared for what felt like a battle. I gathered anything I thought might help: matches, salt, a metal crucifix, and a bucket of kerosene I'd found in the garage. Creak and groan of the house as I worked felt like a warning, but I pushed through my fear. The basement felt different this time. The air was thicker, suffocating and alive with malice. The shadows seemed darker, moving in ways they shouldn't. As I approached the altar, the whispers began again, louder and more insistent than before. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were voices, angry and mocking, demanding that I leave. I placed the idol on the dirt floor, doused it in kerosene, struck a match. The moment the flame touched the idol, the whispers erupted into screams. The walls trembled, the symbols glowing with a sickly light before disintegrating into ash. Shadows lunged at me, clawing and cold, but I held my ground. The idol burned fiercely, the flames consuming it with unnatural speed. A deafening roar filled the room, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then, just as suddenly, there was silence. The oppressive weight lifted, the air became still, and the basement felt empty for the first time. I climbed the stairs, shaking and exhausted but alive. I left the house that night, never to return. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing in the study window watching me leave. Even now, I sometimes wake in the dead of night, certain I hear faint whispers. I can only hope I left whatever it was behind. I left the house that night, stumbling out into the cold night air with my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. The feeling of something behind me, inches from my heels, was too overwhelming. Every step felt like it carried me further from the abyss. But deep down, I knew I wasn't escaping. Not really. As I climbed into my car and slammed the door shut, I finally allowed myself to look at them. House. It loomed in the darkness, its windows like empty eyes, lifeless and yet impossibly watchful. My hands shook as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life and I sped down the empty road, the house disappearing behind me. For a moment I felt relief. The road stretched ahead, endless and safe. But then, in the rearview mirror, something caught my eye. At first, it was just a shadow in the back seat, barely visible. But then it moved, a faint, pale shape began to materialize, its form growing clearer with each passing second, hollow, dark. Eyes stared at me from the mirror, and a twisted grin spread across its face. My chest tightened. His icy fingers brushed the back of my neck. I slammed the brakes, skidding to a stop on the side of the road. Spinning around, I found nothing but empty seats. My breathing came in shallow gasps, my body trembling. Was it gone? Or was it hiding, waiting? I couldn't tell, and that was worse than knowing. I forced myself to drive again, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and the nightmare. But the whispers followed, faint at first, like the wind slipping through a crack in the window, but soon they grew louder. They spoke my name, mocking and angry, promising that I could never truly leave. I didn't sleep that night or the one after. The whispers came no matter where I went. At home, in the car, even in crowded places, I could feel it. Something watching, waiting, just out of sight. Weeks passed, but the haunting didn't fade. And then one morning, as I sat at my kitchen table, exhausted and hollow, I heard it, a knock, soft, rhythmic, and deliberate, coming from the wall. Behind me, I turned slowly, my stomach sinking as I saw the faint outline of a door. The door I thought I had left behind, the door I had sealed shut. Even as I write this, I can feel it. The presence hasn't left me, and I don't think it ever will. Perhaps it's waiting for me to return, or maybe it's waiting for someone else. Someone like you. So, tell me, are you sure you're alone as you finish this story? Or is there a door in your home, one you haven't noticed yet, one that's waiting to be opened? If you dare, share this story. But remember, every retelling brings it closer, closer to you. Driving down a deserted highway at 3 a.m., I thought I was alone, until I saw it. A shadowy figure standing perfectly still in the middle of the road, staring straight at me. What happened next made me wish I'd never taken that route, or looked too closely. The hum of the engine was the only sound, a steady monotone that matched the endless stretch of road ahead. The highway was deserted, its surface glistening faintly under the pale glow of the moon. I wasn't supposed to be here, not at this hour, not in this state, but a call from my sister about our mother's failing health had jolted me from my restless sleep, and now I was hurtling down this desolate road at 3, alone. The silence in the car was deafening, broken only by the faint static of the radio. I'd tried tuning it to a station, but the knob seemed stuck, the static growing louder no matter how far I turned it. The isolation began to settle in my chest like a weight. The road seemed unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that feels alive, watching. My headlights flickered once, briefly plunging the world into darkness before snapping back on. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, a chill prickling the back of my neck. The road ahead stretched endlessly, with no curves, no signs, no end in sight. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the highway, illuminated by my dim headlights. At first, it looked human, vaguely humanoid, but the closer I got, the more wrong it seemed. It was unnaturally still, its shape blurry at the edges, as though it didn't fully belong in this world. I slowed the car, my pulse pounding in my ears. My instincts screamed at me to stop, to turn back, but I couldn't look away. The figure's head tilted as though it had noticed me. Then, as the figure stepped forward, its jerky motion unnatural, as though a puppet string were being pulled by an unsteady hand. I gripped the wheel tightly, my knuckles white against the leather, debating my next move.
Do I honk? Swerve around. Stop. Every logical response seemed
Inadequate, overridden by the primal fear clawing at my chest. As I slowed the car to a near crawl, the figure's shape became clearer. It was tall but slightly hunched, its silhouette blurry as though wrapped in a haze. My headlights passed over it, but instead of revealing details, clothes, skin, anything solid, it seemed to absorb the light, leaving only a void where a person should be. My pulse quickened as its head turned sharply toward me, or at least I thought it did. Its face was a blank expanse, a yawning absence that sent a cold shiver rippling through my body. But there was a pull to it, a sensation that I couldn't describe, a force that made it impossible to look away. The figure tilted its head, as if observing me, and then it moved again. This time, it stepped directly into the path of my car. I slammed the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt, my chest lurching against the seatbelt. For a moment, the figure stood there, unmoving. Then, without warning, it vanished. My breath hitched as I scanned the road ahead, hoping it was gone, praying it was a trick of my overtired mind. But then my headlights caught it again, further down the road, standing perfectly still. My heart pounded as I pressed the accelerator, speeding toward it in blind panic. Yet no matter how far I drove, it remained ahead of me, waiting, always just out of reach. I couldn't escape it. The figure wasn't chasing me, not in the way something human might. It didn't run or follow. It simply existed, warping the space around me, defying time and distance. Every time I looked at the road, there it was, sometimes ahead, other times in the periphery of my vision, hovering just outside the range of my headlights. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, its shape would flicker behind me, growing closer with every blink. The radio crackled, a burst of static that made me jump. I twisted the knob frantically, trying to turn it off, but it wouldn't budge. Amid the hissing noise, faint whispers emerged. My name. I was certain I heard my name, spoken in a voice that didn't belong to me. Suddenly, the car shuddered, the engine stalling mid-drive. The headlights flickered, plunging me into total darkness. The silence was suffocating. My trembling hands fumbled with the keys. As I tried to restart the engine, the cold sweat dripping down my back making me shiver harder. Then the chill in the air. And then I saw it. The figure was no longer ahead of me. It was beside the car, leaning into the passenger window. My breath caught in my throat as its featureless face pressed against the glass, an unnatural void radiating cold. It didn't move or make a sound, but its presence screamed danger, louder than word ever could. With a desperate twist of the key, the engine roared to life. The headlights snapped back on, and the figure was gone. I didn't hesitate. Slamming the pedal to the floor, I sped off into the night, my eyes darting to every shadow, certain it would reappear. Ahead, a faint light flickered on the horizon, a beacon of hope, or perhaps something worse. The light grew closer, illuminating a small building at the edge of the highway. Relief flooded through me. It looked like a diner, with a glowing sign flickering above its roof. I pulled into the gravel lot, my tires crunching to a halt. But something wasn't right. The windows were dark, the parking lot empty. The sign above the diner sputtered faintly, casting erratic shadows on the building's facade. As I stepped out of the car, a biting wind whipped across the lot, carrying with it a sound, low whispers that seemed to drift from every direction. And then I saw it again. The figure was standing in front of the diner, motionless, blocking the entrance. Its form was more distorted now, its edges wavering like smoke caught in a breeze. My legs trembled as I tried to move, but a strange compulsion kept me rooted to the spot. It wasn't just fear, it was something else, an invisible force pulling me toward it. Against my better judgment, I took a step forward, then another. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself had thickened. The figure seemed to dissolve as I got closer, its shape unraveling into tendrils of shadow that spiraled around me. The world shifted, the ground disappeared, replaced by a vast black void. I was no longer standing in front of the diner. I was nowhere. Whispers surrounded me, growing louder, their words fragmented but filled with malice. Flashed before my eyes, scenes from my life, memories I'd buried, mistakes I'd tried to forget. And then a voice, "You don't belong here."
I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness.
A sudden jerk, it took a step forward. When I opened my eyes, the light was blinding, but it wasn't comforting. It wasn't the soft glow. of safety or the warmth of a sunrise. It was harsh, cold, and pale, like the kind of light that bleeds through the cracks of something unnatural. I was in my car, still on the highway, my head pressed against the steering wheel. My breath came in shallow gasps as my body struggled to piece together where I was and what had just happened. Everything felt wrong. The hum of the car engine was off, a low, guttural sound that barely resembled the vehicle I had driven here. I sat upright, gripping the wheel, and glanced around. The highway stretched ahead, deserted, but not in the peaceful way it had been hours before. The air itself felt heavier now, suffused with a presence I couldn't name. Every shadow on the road seemed alive, rippling and stretching in ways that defied logic. The radio crackled suddenly, the sound breaking the eerie silence. I nearly jumped out of my seat. Static hissed loudly, and then, my name, not loud, not clear, but unmistakably my name, whispered over and over. It wasn't just a voice, it was voices, layers of them speaking in a chaotic symphony that filled the cabin. My hands trembled as I reached for the knob to turn it off, but it wouldn't budge. Get out. The words came sharp and clear, cutting through the static. They weren't shouted, they were said with calm, deliberate malice. My heart raced, and instinctively, I looked into the rear view. Mirror, mirror. I froze. The shadow was back, sitting in the back seat, staring straight at me. It wasn't human. It was formless, yet solid, a void that consumed the light around it. Its face, if it could be called that, was a shifting blur of darkness, and yet I felt its gaze pierce through me. My chest tightened as icy tendrils of fear crept up my spine. Slowly, shakily, I turned to look at the back seat. It was empty. But when I glanced back at the mirror, the shadow had moved closer. It wasn't in the back seat anymore. It was sitting next to me. I could feel its presence, its cold, oppressive weight pressing against my side. My breathing turned shallow and rapid, and I instinctively slammed my foot on the accelerator. The car lurched forward, the tires screeching as I sped down the highway. The road ahead stretched on endlessly, the horizon, a faint blur of light. Knuckles white on the steering wheel, praying the thing in the car would vanish, but it didn't. Shadow flickered at the edge of my vision, a reminder that I wasn't alone. Then I saw it again, the figure. It stood at the side of the highway, unmoving, but this time its presence was heavier. As I passed it, I couldn't stop myself. I turned my head. Its head tilted as though it were smiling. I drove faster, the road blurring, the static on the radio growing louder, the voices more frantic. Whispers of my name swirled through the air, filling the cabin, seeping into my thoughts. I couldn't drown them out. You can't leave. The words repeated over and over, growing louder until they roared in my ears. The car began to shudder, the steering wheel jerking violently in my hands as though something was trying to rip it away. Lights began to flicker ahead, blinding erratic flashes that made it impossible to see. The car screeched to a stop on its own, the engine stalling. And then, silence. I sat there gripping the wheel, afraid to look anywhere but straight ahead, but in the periphery of my vision, I saw the shadow taking shape again. This time, not outside the car, not in the mirror, but forming in the passenger seat. My breath hitched as its darkness seeped into the space next to me, cold and suffocating. It leaned closer. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place. A single, cold whisper brushed against my ear. You belong to the highway now. The next thing I knew, I was waking up again, parked on the side of the road. The sun was rising, its soft warmth spilling over the horizon. It felt normal, too normal. But when I glanced into the rearview mirror, there it was, a faint, dark smudge, like a shadow, refusing to leave. My pulse raced as I sped away, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light. Yet the whisper lingered, faint but unmistakable, woven into the soft static of the radio. As I drove, the road stretched endlessly ahead. A sense of dread settled deep in my chest. That highway wasn't just a place. It was alive, watching, waiting. I know it's not done with me. Yet. Are you sure you're safe as you read this? Look around. Do the shadows seem darker? Tonight, does the static hum of your surroundings feel a little too loud? Share the story. If you dare, but remember, every retelling draws it closer to you.